There's so many, even small companies, where the turnover might be very small, the profit's quite small, and yet directors still manage to see seemingly £1 million for the whole of the board. And in a small company, it can make a really big difference, of course. You could argue that in a very, very big company, we might be complaining about somebody earning 20 million, but if they're bringing in billions, you probably won't notice a change in his salary. However, we need to know what's going on behind the scenes, and that's why I thought we'll have a little session. Cliff probably does know what goes on behind the scenes, who's pushing for what, and how do these things get agreed. So I thought, why not have a Q&A about it? So I guess to start the ball rolling, Cliff, when companies come up with these grand new schemes, I mean, who is usually pushing for those? Is it the executives? Is it the remuneration committee that thinks, let's do something for our money, we'll dream up a new scheme? Or is it shareholders, amazingly, who say, we want you fully incentivised so that the money comes in, let's have a new scheme?
I think normally it's the executives. They're very good negotiators. They do deals, don't they, all the time? And they have a certain ability to be able to negotiate for themselves when the time comes. When they first get hired, the chief executive has to do a deal. There's a psychological deal and a legal deal as well. So that's what drives it. But you can take the case of Burberry, where the chief executive got hired by Apple, Angela Ahrendts. The share price dropped in value by 500 million. And then the remuneration committee got scared, and they had to decide what to do to make sure they kept the next executive.
But of course, it's the remuneration committee that we all hear about as shareholders being in charge of remuneration. So is it the executives pushing as far as they can with the remuneration committee? Or is it a question of the executives say, we need to hire a remuneration consultant, he'll know how much I'm worth?
Well, the legal situation is that the committee is a subcommittee of the board. The remuneration committee is a subcommittee of the board. They delegate that authority to that subcommittee, which is made up of non-executive directors, and they can hire independent consultants to help them do their work. That's what they should do.
And the independent the independent consultants that come in, of which you know well, they're being paid for effectively by the board, by the company, even though as shareholders we're providing the funds for that. Are they really going to be very strong and go against the executives and say, actually, it's not that you need a new deal, you are paid too much compared to where your market level is, you should be paid less? Would they ever say that if they're going to be paid for by the board?
It's not a very good business model, is it?
Definitely not. So maybe every year when we see the pay levels going up, is that a function of the fact that everybody's chasing each other's payment level up and the remuneration consultants are agreeing and saying, actually, the levels have gone up since last year, we need to pay you more?
So David's saying, is the pay levels going up? Yes, in 1998, the FTSE chief executive was paid £1 million a year. Now he's paid £5 million a year. It's just a gradual increase. It's not just salaries. It's bonuses, it's long-term incentives, sometimes occasionally it's pensions as well. There's a great variety of schemes. So there's a lot of complexity, which is one of the complaints at the moment.
Mark?
Yes, question here. I'm going to AstraZeneca's AGM in a few weeks, in a couple of weeks' time. They've very obviously got a problem with the remuneration committee, and that the chairman is the chief executive of another FTSE 100 company, which is clearly not the way to do it. But on a more positive note, what should we look for? What should we be pushing for as shareholders, as the members of remuneration committees? Who do you want on remuneration committees? What sort of people?
We want strong people who are independent of mind and of character. And we want people who can apply common sense. The BP example is you've lost £5.6 billion and you put up your pay by 20%. It's laughable. It doesn't doesn't make sense to the man in the street. It's provided loads and loads of headlines, and the BP board have looked very, very foolish about it.
You often get the leaders of British public companies saying, well, we might be paid a lot of money, but compare us to a fund manager or a corporate broker, and actually our pay doesn't seem so bad, and actually their pay isn't in the public domain. So they're getting away with it, and we're getting underpaid, and if you don't pay us, you're hurting British business.
Yeah, and hedge fund managers get paid a lot more than the ordinary long-only fund managers as well, and the private equity people as well. But that's life, that's business. These people who are running big companies are not going to go and move to hedge funds. It's a different skill set. It's a jolly difficult job running a hedge fund. And it's a great skill to be able to persuade people to put your money in your fund and then take 2 plus 20%. You're right, there are people paid more than these chief executives. Also, often the argument is people are paid more in the United States. But not very many people go from the UK to the United States. It's a different culture, it's a totally different environment. They come from there to come here because it's nice in England.
The favourite measure seems to be earnings per share, which encourages wasteful share buybacks. Why don't they have a profit component calculation?
Right. 2 questions there, one about earnings per share, one about profit, linking to profits. If you take the Reed Elsevier, I like to call it, it's now called RELX, their AGM's on Thursday this week. In their long-term incentive plan, I think 30% of the total payout is based on earnings per share. And in order to achieve 52% of the maximum payout, you have to achieve 6% growth in earnings per share per annum over 3 years. Now, that's not too tough a target, is it? But then you remember that they've actually bought back 9.2% of their shares over the last 5 years. They're buying back 2% a year. So profits only have to go up by 4% a year for earnings per share to go up by 6% a year. So that's a problem with earnings per share, and it's a problem with the Remuneration Committee being rather soft with management. And there is a negotiation which goes on when it comes down to targets. And I think that one's the management have walked over the non-executives. Now, your second question was about profit sharing. John Lewis have a simple approach. They have a profit share and a profit share pool for everybody so that people's pay goes up. If profits go up, it goes down if profits go down. I think it's a very good idea, actually. It simplifies pay in a way if you have an element of profit sharing, because then you can say to your shareholders, to your customers and to your employees, look, that element of pay has gone up or gone down. You then worry about other elements of pay which you may be paying for achieving different targets, the BP debate. But you've got to divide this up as to what you're paying for. And profit sharing, I think, is a good idea. It adds clarity.
From a macro perspective, if you had the chance, what would you do?
If you would start again. I ban pensions, defined benefit pensions. The man at RELX has got a 30th of accrual rate, which means for each year of service, he gets a 30th of his final pensionable salary. A man at BP, similar arrangement, it includes bonus as well. Absolutely disgraceful that that's allowed to continue. I wouldn't allow people to have 5 different incentive schemes. RELX have 5. Bonus incentive plan, which is a sort of matching bonus plan, long-term incentive plan, share options, and the Reed Elsevier growth plan from 2012, which is now in run-off mode. And then it's this much in the annual report for all the different awards under it. Far too many.
I mean, they become far too complex over the last few years. An annual report, on average, can have literally only a couple of pages about what the company does and might have a remuneration report that goes to 40 pages. It's just crazy.
Yeah, absolutely. It's wrong. I mean, you want to know what's important to the business. What are the drivers of the business? Remuneration is a minor driver of the business. It is an area where there's a conflict of interest for the executive directors. So I think you should be very clear in explaining what the chief executive's pay is. But you don't need all this stuff in the annual remuneration report. A lot of it could have been put on the World Wide Web, but Vince Cable failed to do that. We did suggest it to him, but he didn't listen.
So in the same way that the companies employ a remuneration consultant and the remuneration committee supposedly are doing their work, why can't we have a centrally appointed non-remuneration committee or non-remuneration consultant that has to look at every single company's remuneration report, a specialist who attacks it from a different level and decides whether these are very fair for shareholders, whether they're too complex, and actually reports on them officially? I know in the big companies we've got the perks and the companies, organisations that analyse everything. But once you go smaller, there's nothing. So they're not going to report on something that's a small company. So are there any plans, anything that we could do to try and put these in check?
Yeah, that's what ShareSoc have decided to do, actually. They're going to have specific guidelines for smaller companies, which will identify what is good practice and what is poor practice. And so we've come up with 5 pillars of good remuneration. Something about level, making sure it's a reasonable percentage of the total pay. About share ownership, that the management owns significant amounts of shares and retain those shares. About clarity and transparency in what you're actually explaining to shareholders. I can give you some good examples where that doesn't occur. The fourth one about the pay and performance linkage. Companies have to report now on their total shareholder return over a 7-year period, and then their total pay, and the bonus as a percentage of maximum paid, and their LTIPs, how much is vested over a 7-year period. So you can instantly see at a glance whether there's a reasonable linkage of pay and performance. AIM companies don't have to do that at the moment, but we think they should do. And the fifth one is about good governance and good practices, making sure that AIM companies ask their shareholders before they give 15% of their shares away to management.
Yeah, I mean, we all know about Visling. I mean, that's just been a horrendous scheme for shareholders. Yeah. Share price has collapsed since they announced it. What can shareholders really do to stop it, though? Because by the time Visling announced it, it was just after their AGM. They didn't officially have to have a vote on it anyway. Yeah. How are we going to stop them for the future?
Well, I think you can try and educate directors. I think we'll send a copy of these ShareSoc remuneration guidelines to all the companies. But more importantly, I think it's the nomads. And brokers. They have an important role in this. Somebody must have given Visling some advice that this is reasonable. So in future, those nomads will have access to what ShareSoc think is reasonable, and that will flag it up very clearly that was not reasonable.
And who's peddling these new schemes where the shareholders have been raped to the tune of 15% of their equity?
Lawyers, remuneration consultants, accountants, professional advisors. They get paid fees for that.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Are there any particular people that you implement?
No. I don't like receiving letters from lawyers. I try to avoid that. It happened in the past once.
Just before you mentioned Visling, I was about to ask on Visling. Is there not an element of what goes around comes around? Because that action of going to AIM, putting in an LTIP, fees that have not been disclosed, has caused the share price to tank. Now that does not reflect well on management, the executive management or the non-executive management. So the people who are to blame are the institutions who support that, who have meetings with those people. We can't affect whether Hawkins stays in place at Visling.
Yeah.
They're a disaster to deal with. I've held shares since they were silver mines. I mean, it was so long ago,
Yeah.
one can't even imagine. Well, they are not responsive, or terribly responsive.
No.
And yet their share prices tank. They should, there are people who are supporting them who are not in this room who can have any influence. And those are the people who have to do something.
I mean, I've been so heavily involved at Vislink. Now, the number one issue there, when we as individuals see these things, we're outraged. The website, you've seen all the comments on there. Lots of the people are still shareholders. They've got an AGM coming up in about a month and a half time. It's absolutely critical that we all turn up at the AGM, that we make our voices heard, get the press involved, the media involved, and even more important, that you write to the fund managers who are there listed on the shareholder register, and you ask what action have they taken since these schemes were announced. And it's almost like we've got to turn everything on its head. I think at some point we're going to have to ask the fund managers officially what they're paid, whether that's bearing any resemblance to the fact that they've not voted or done anything against the schemes. And we've probably, at some point, got to embarrass at least one or two fund managers, because if they're regularly not taking action on these things, they're letting us down, especially in small companies, because we depend on the big fund manager that's in each of the companies that are involved. I can tell you I've spoken to quite a few of them. One, unbelievably, said to me, after having looked at it, well, if we'd known about it, we probably would have said something to them, but we didn't know about it. We weren't consulted, even though Vislink's remuneration head said they'd consulted with the major shareholders. They clearly hadn't. They gave that job to their brokers to do. But the other thing is that they said, it's too small a position for us. We don't want to spend any more time on it. So they weren't going to get involved to do anything anyway. And this is the issue. They just won't spend the effort or the time.
There seems to be a misconception, though, that we've given away 15% of the equity in Vislink, whereas there is it is 15% of the equity above a market.
Yeah, it is above a level.
There maybe is a misconception that actually the shareholders have been raped, and they are so underwater on that at the moment that actually it's worth nothing. The only thing it's detriment to shareholders is the fees it costs and the lack of trust in management forever going down that path.
Exactly.
It's worse than that, because the executives who've been given these wonderful growth shares have now got something which is worthless. So that's going to demotivate them as well.
Well, they're going to invent something else, though.
There'll be something else coming along.
It's a real mess because of the way they've structured it. But can I say that on the ShareSoc website, there's now something called the Remuneration Forum, and there's a report on a number of companies. One of them included is Vislink, and there's quite a nice, conservatively written, polite, professional report, not too libelous, and that it can be sent to fund managers, I'm sure.
Very good. Yeah, I think if everybody writes, fund managers will hate having lots of people turning a spotlight on them, and they'll start to think, we can't keep having this. We've got to sort out some of these problems before they happen. And you're right in that they haven't yet got 15% of the company. But how about the nerve that they had to even put it in place in the first hand? So we've got to stop all the knock-on effect of every other company even thinking they can do that. If we don't attack when it happens, it'll go on elsewhere.
The press environment at the moment is open to this. So
we'll have a field
this
day
is
with
a
press.
perfect time to do this.
Yeah.
They don't tend to write up small companies, but they'll write up the odd one.
Fatty Hawkins will hate the blow-up doll that I've got of him. He's not going to like it.
Is there a case for doing what MM&K didn't do and making the shareholder vote binding?
The shareholder vote is actually two votes. There's one on the policy, which is a binding vote, and then there's an advisory vote on how much you've actually paid out. So the policy is a sort of forward-looking thing which tends to work for 3 years, and happens every 3 years. It could well be that there's a case for that. And Vince Cable recently said he wished he'd put employee representatives on the Remuneration Committee to have some outside perspective. But perhaps we should have investor representatives on that Remuneration Committee.
I'm just struck by the fact that I used to be in a share plan consultancy, and I'm just struck by how few people in that world, whether it be lawyers or accountants, very few of them invest, very few of them understand the way the city really works. They may be great technically from a legal point of view or from a design and doing spreadsheets, but actually understanding the essence of what drives value in businesses, they don't fully understand. So often they might go to the broker, and we had a situation recently at Tristel where they had an override linked to the share price hitting a certain target over a 30-day period, and apparently the directors went to FinCat and asked them whether they thought they should alert shareholders to a change in the revenue targets that the company would like to achieve, whether that would be relevant and might impact the share plan. FinCat had no knowledge, didn't really understand. They said yes, it was okay. And it's just generally everyone just passing the buck, not really having an understanding. Ultimately, it's the shareholders who do. The big institutions, as we've said, probably don't have much of an incentive to get busy because ultimately they've got 100 shares in their portfolio, and to get involved in each individual one is too time consuming. So, I mean, and if we can't rely on the NEDs to stand up, don't we need something within the law which says that nomads, for instance, would have to sign off on a share plan to say that it's in the financial interest of shareholders?
There's name law which they do. But your point about these so-called professional advisors, that often they're not allowed to own shares. If you're an accountant or lawyer, you're not allowed to own shares, and they don't understand what it means. I invest in shares. I've invested in shares for a long, long time, and I don't trade them, but I'm a long-term holder. But you certainly have a different perspective. When I joined my company MM&K, Remuneration Consultants, I had 13% of the company. When we made a decision around the board table, we thought, well, will this actually make the company better? And we were thinking 3-5 years out. When I worked for Mercer, part of Marsh McLennan, the decision was, will it help us achieve the budget this year? And it's hopelessly short term as the way these organisations are managed.
And to be honest, if they employ lawyers, I mean, Tristel, how you can have something called a long-term incentive plan that has a 30-day kicker on the share price is just unbelievable. So that long-term incentive plan could have lasted 31 days. I mean, it's just ridiculous. Anyway, it's always good to learn about what goes on behind the scenes. Thank you very much, Cliff. Thank you.